Before we begin today's video, I would like to give a shout out to one of our newest subscribers, Jack Newhouse. Thank you for subscribing, and welcome to the family. And now on with today's video. Greetings, my dear viewers. It is I, Drahon, and welcome back to Dungeons & Dragons Character Concept, the Plane Shift series. In this series, we take a look at each race within Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and see what backgrounds and classes are possible to match up with those races. To see what type of characters we can make just off of the lore of those races. And as a part of the Plane Shift series, we are taking a look at the series supplement of Plane Shift. Today is Zendikar with the core race. At least I hope that's how it's pronounced, because that's how it's spelled. The core are a interesting race. They are the secondary race of Zendikar next to the elves. Mostly you will see them either scaling the cliffs or gliding through the skies on their gliders, or perhaps they're working to make weapons out of stone. There are two known sub-races within the lore of the core, and those are the in-core and the ill-core. There didn't really seem to be much of a difference between the two, other than the ill-core sort of being more associated with spies, thieves, and other types of sort of underground work, while the in-core are more of the artisans, I suppose. There wasn't really much on the wiki page that I could find to distinguish the two, so yeah. Anyway, those are the two sub-races. Now, technically the core can be found in multiple different planes. One such plane is the plane where the Strixhaven School is, and those core there are mostly teachers. You can find them in either the Lorehold or the Silver Quill colleges. So that's why the Strixhaven student background is listed here. Other backgrounds that are possible are the Acolyte, the Archaeologist, Hermit, Knight, Outlander, Soldier, and Spy. As for the classes, the most common classes that are among the Magic the Gathering card game, at least, are the following: Artificer, Cleric, Fighter, Rogue, and Wizard. Now, take a trip with me and see what subclasses best fit the core. See what type of character you might want to play as. And of course we need to start off with the Artificer. The Stoneforgers is technically the Artificer subclass. We had this problem before when we did the build for the Planeswalker Nahiri, as there was no Stoneforge Artificer. However, there are a couple of specialists that might be able to take the place of the Stoneforge until one can be released. And I believe those specialists are going to be the Battlesmith, the Forge Adept, and the Maverick. The Battlesmith is the only quote-unquote core class, subclass, while the Forge Adept and the Maverick are technically second party. releases thanks to the head of Eberron rising from the last wars, Keith Baker, which is why I count them as a core, but they're technically not core for the purposes of some of my other videos. So, with that being said, the Forge Adept and the Maverick seem like a good option for if you're looking for that Stoneforge substitute. But other than that, you might be going with a battlesmith. Possibly even an artillerist, but that is less likely. Next is the Barbarian. I really didn't see too many examples of a Barbarian other than this Balduvan Berserker, which, of course, ties into the Berserker Barbarian. But I can see the Storm Herald as another possible primal path for a core Barbarian, and I'll explain exactly why Storm Herald once we get into the Cleric. There is a god that the core worship, known as Ymira, who is said to be a god of the sky and wind. However, as you can see in the flavor text for the Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, Ymira doesn't exist. She is a false memory of one of the Eldrazi Titans, Imrakul. Which is kind of curious, because there are angels of Ymira within the Zendikar blocks. Again, this is very curious, and I would like to see a deck with this sort of concept in mind. Cores following Ymira, or Imrakul. I could see the deck being a red, white, and colorless to sort of tie into Imrakul being an Eldrazi. But anyway, with this idea in mind, and if there are some core who know the truth behind Ymira being Imrakul, you could have a cleric still serving Imrakul using the Mind Domain instead of the Tempest Domain that represents the goddess of the air and sky, Imra. Or you could have those who don't follow Ymra or Imrakul and are just following the domains of Tempest or the Forge, because we do know that some clerics don't serve a divine power. So that is entirely possible. Or maybe there is a god of the Forge that is not known for the core. Moving on to Druid, I want to bring this little piece of lore up, known as World Gifts. Every core family elects a child, typically the second born, to abandon to the wilderness as a sacrifice to pacify the natural forces of Zendikar. Some of the abandoned children, called World Gifts, die quickly, but many of them manage to survive long enough to start new lives outside the core nomadic families. A World Gift core typically adopts the language and customs of the culture with whom they mature. Tragically, most never feel at home among the quote-unquote static races. Driven by wanderlust, many World Gift core end up venturing back out into the wilds at some point in their lives, but are never welcomed back into core society. That is a weird piece of lore, but I feel that's going to be what drives most core adventurers, is being these world gifts. that manage to survive into adulthood. And it says that they will adopt the language and customs of the culture whom with they mature. So that makes me think that they do end up mixing in with some elf cultures, which seems to be the case because one of Nissa Ravine's traveling companions was actually a core for a little while. A little while being her traveling companion. They were still... You get the point. For a little while, one of Nissa's traveling companions was a core. So, it makes sense that a druid core would be an option. More specifically, the Circle of the Land, with either forest or mountain, since the core are cliff climbers and glider users. So it makes sense to have mountain and forest for these world gifts that are able to survive until maturity. Moving on is the fighter, another one of the more common classes that you might have as a core. For the martial archetype, the arcane archer, banneret, cavalier, and scout seem to be the most likely. Another interesting fact about core are twins. Typically, when there are twins, they are trained to be lancers. And a lot of the time, when a lancer is portrayed in a card, they are on a mount. Both of the siblings are on a mount together. So, cavalier sort of makes sense. Arcane Archer is technically a elf restricted subclass, which works with the core, like I said earlier, with the world gift core, being able to mix and mingle with some of the other cultures on Zendikar, like with elves. So it makes sense for a couple of core to take up this practice of the Arcane Archer. Moving on to Monk. There was only one core Monk card, the Lone Missionary. So I thought it would make sense to mention Monk, but there wasn't really much examples other than that one card. And it did not exactly give us a monastic tradition to go off of. But with how the core operates, I think that the monastic tradition that would best fit a core would be the Kinsei monk and the Shadow monk. The Shadow monk is more of those core in Dominaria, some of the ill core who have taken up the life of thievery, but also have this weird connection to etherealness. They're able to sort of fade in and out of reality because of their time in the shadows of Dominaria. Or at least that's what I was able to gather from the lore. Very strange. The only real time where the ill core are stated to have some form of difference to the in core. Now, we don't actually have a mechanic for this with the core race on Planeshift Zendikar, so you're going to have to try to find class features that best fit this non-mechanic. And that's why I thought the Shadow Monk could work. Moving on to Paladin, there were two strange core cards, the Lawbringer and the Lightbringer. With those cards in mind, I thought of the Paladin Sacred Oath of Vengeance and the Watchers. And this is definitely true after the Eldrazi invaded Zendikar. they'll probably want to take up arms against these otherworldly threats that try to invade their home, much like the Phyrexians did many years later. So an Oath of the Watchers does make sense. And also the Oath of Vengeance could be for those times when they're fighting against dark forces of black mana, much like how the Lightbringer does state that it faces off against dark forces. It banishes a black mana creature. So Vengeance would work with that. But also against the red mana creatures, like with the Lawbringer. I'm starting to make little sense here, so let's go ahead and move on. Next is the Ranger, and this is sort of a reference to the Knight of Cliffhaven with the Conclave of Drakewarden. But also some other Ranger conclaves that would make sense are the Gloomstalker, once again referencing those Ilkor, and the Horizon Walker to reference anyone trying to fight off against the Eldrazi's or even the Phyrexians. Next is the Rogue, another very common class for a core, definitely for those Ilkor. From other planes, you have your Assassins, your Phantom, your Scout, and your Thief. Next is the Warlock. Like I said, some of the core might not care that Imra is in fact Imrakul, so they could still serve under the Eldrazi by becoming a warlock with the otherworldly patron of the Great Old One. Or they can serve one of the angels that supposedly serve Imra, so the otherworldly patron of the Celestial also makes sense. Next is Wizard. I wasn't too sure how to actually put Wizard in here, since the main quote-unquote tradition that the core would follow are lithomancers, which, again, don't exist within Dungeons & Dragons. But I feel that these arcane traditions would still fit with the core. The arcane tradition of blade singing, divination, transmutation, and war magic. Transmutation would be that substitute for the lithomancers, since transmuters are still transmuting the earth and stone in some cases. While, once again, blade singing is a reference to any world gifts that happen to mature within an elvish society. And that is all I have for you today, my dear viewers. What did you think? Are you planning on playing a core as your next character? Let me know what they're like in the comments below. Until next time, this has been Drahan, and I am offline.